Forthcoming. I'm Matthew Bowman. I'm the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies here at Claremont Graduate University. I'm really grateful that we are finally having in-person events again. This is one of the first in a while. And I'm pleased to welcome a really excellent speaker. This is George Handley. He is a professor of interdisciplinary humanities at Brigham Young University. That means a lot of things. He does a lot of things. He was trained as a scholar of literature. He's worked on postcolonialism, has published books on the post-slavery literature of the Americas, that's one, more recently on ecocriticism. And he's written a number of more thoughtful, I think, essay-like works, and an autobiography called Home Waters with the University of Utah as well. He is, I think, it is fair to say, maybe the most creative and one of the most important thinkers on Mormonism and the environment working today. So he is going to speak to us tonight on this problem. What is ecotheology? Can there be a Mormon version of ecotheology? So with that, we will turn it over to George.
Well, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you, Matt, for the invitation and for being a gracious host. Let me just get my iPad set up here so I know what I'm looking at. I've got a keyboard here that I don't need. Okay, maybe this will work. And thanks for coming. I live in the West, but where I live is the Wild West. You guys live in civilized California. I'm teasing. I did all my higher education in California, so you know where that's coming from. But anyway, in Utah, we've been meeting in person for quite a long time. Almost never thought that never acknowledged that there was a pandemic happening in some places. So I'm glad that you could be out tonight and join in this conversation. So I started at BYU in the late 1990s, 1998, and I arrived with some sort of side ambition to write about my faith and environmental stewardship, and that was inspired by an experience I had at Northern Arizona University, where I taught for 3 years before coming to BYU. I didn't intend it to become a central focus of my research, but it kind of snowballed over the many years that I started writing about it. And I sort of culminated a lot of that research recently in my book, The Hope of Nature, which was published in 2020. In fact, the book launch lecture was weeks after the lockdown and COVID, and so I gave one of the first lectures out into the void at that time. My efforts to write about this also took on the form of environmental advocacy in the civic sphere. Environmental organizations in Utah were pretty excited to take advantage of the labors of a Latter-day Saint who spoke fluent Mormon and could reach out to Latter-day Saint faithful across seemingly insurmountable cultural barriers that exist in the state of Utah between at least has been historically between some environmental efforts and some Mormon communities. So I became an activist as well as a scholar, and then I even decided to try my hand at creative writing, trying any way I could to invent a language that would inspire more environmental concern. And my reason for that was that I was of the conviction, and I remain of that conviction, that the theology of the Latter-day Saint tradition is not only compatible with care for the earth, but that the doctrines and teachings of the church give expression to the importance of what we might call earth stewardship in an unusual and pronounced way, so much so that the difference between the church's pro-environmental doctrines and the sometimes anti-environmental ethos of Latter-day Saint culture in places like Utah, especially in the Intermountain West more generally, begged for an explanation. And as the years have passed, I have seen a shift in attitudes among members and even in the pronouncements of church leaders. We have also seen an outpouring of scholarly attention We have seen an edited volume from the Religious Studies Center in 2005, special issue of Dialogue in 2011, Sunstone, I think it was 2010, I'm not sure. A recent international journal called Religions in 2022 published a handful of articles on Latter-day Saint ecotheology, a handful of essays in BYU Studies, 2 books of essays in the Maxwell Institute's Living Faith series, one by myself, the one I mentioned, and another by Steve Peck, a biologist at BYU, and a collection of essays about environmental history in Mormonism called The Earth Will Appear as the Garden of Eden, published by the University of Utah Press. Gospel Topics essay on conservation and stewardship appeared around 2015, and we've seen statements by such recent leaders as President Nelson, Elder Ballard, Elder Snow, Elder Nash, Elder Oaks, and finally this recent general conference by Bishop Cossé, which I think was a monumental historic moment. At BYU, we've seen a tectonic shift that has resulted in a sustainability coordinator at the university, unprecedented student interest and activism, and a robust cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary conversation about the environment on the campus. And there's also been a general shift in the political ethos in Utah that portends at least the beginnings of a change among LDS faithful in the Intermountain West. The congressional delegation of Utah today has shifted in the direction of concern for climate change and other environmental issues, which is a marked difference than just 10 years ago. There's plenty of work to do, but I'm gratified and encouraged by these trends. So in my presentation, I want to provide first an overview of the doctrines of stewardship that I believe should inspire better care for the earth. Doctrines that I believe are starting to get the attention that they deserve. And then I want to pivot into one deeper doctrinal challenge that LDS theology presents that I believe provides a clue to our continued resistance to embracing an ethic of care. When I first started to write about this topic in the early 2000s, my task was relatively simple in my mind. I was engaged in what I had learned from other eco-theologians as in the job of mining a tradition for its environmental wisdom, wherever I could find it. Religions across the world were doing likewise, trying to rescue neglected teachings and create a new ethos on the basis of doctrine. Mormonism was by no means unique in the religious landscape in the age of climate change in discovering that it had been somewhat ineffective and unresponsive to the crisis. Like other religious traditions, the LDS tradition needed to rethink our values and assumptions and to reread our scriptures in light of new challenges, something that every religion has to do throughout its history with regard to all kinds of issues, including the environment, if it hopes to be sustainable culturally over time. So we can think of other contemporary challenges such as race, gender, sexuality, and how an adequate LDS response to such challenges might require a combination of mining and creative revision and reinterpretation of doctrine. And of course, in a church as ours, such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that believes in continual revelation, the hope and aspiration to receive new revelation. In this effort of pivoting, pre-existing doctrines and teachings can be helpful or hurtful depending on the issue for any religion. But in the face of a global environmental crisis and Mormonism, I think the story is that the implications of our exceptionally helpful doctrines have simply been left unexplored almost entirely. So it's not as if we have massive doctrinal obstacles in the way, we've just simply neglected them. We have, in the LDS tradition, I'm speaking as a member of that tradition, have a veritable treasure trove of doctrines and teachings to inspire stewardship, which is one reason why when Bishop Cossé addressed environmental stewardship in conference recently, he didn't say anything at first glance that LDS faithful weren't at least peripherally familiar with, but what he did was, in fact, truly historic. this was the first of its kind in our history. Specifically, it was actually the second speech by a general authority about environmental stewardship, exclusively dedicated to that topic, but the first one at a general conference. The first one was Elder Nash in 2013. But it was barely noticed, and it didn't make any headlines. Certainly in comparison to the reactions we have seen when a general authority attempts to speak about the importance of gender equality or the need to root out racism or LGBTQ rights or whatever the social issue might be. Our particular Mormon moment seems to be characterized by an outsized concern for social justice and identity, but little, if any, attention to environmental justice and the plight of the developing world in the Anthropocene. This lack of attention to the climate crisis, even among so-called progressives in the church, continues to amaze and dismay me. I'm certainly not alone in believing that no challenge the world faces at this time is larger or more daunting than climate change. And I don't say that this is not going to work, as though my prop here is falling. I don't say that because I think the environment trumps social concerns. I want to be clear. Matt mentioned I'm trained as a post-colonialist, and I've written quite extensively about post-colonial eco-criticism and post-colonial environmental issues. Environmental problems exacerbate and multiply the problems of inequality that already plague societies. And I stand with how Pope Francis has expressed it. We will continue to be dangerous to the natural world to the degree that we remain dangerous to one another. But we won't solve the problem of social injustice if we don't give due attention to the environment. So allow me to summarize what I consider to be the most important doctrines of stewardship in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then in order to then make an argument about one doctrine in particular that remains neglected and little understood even now for its significance and relevance to our time. So the first doctrinal point is what we know in the Latter-day Saint tradition as the spiritual creation, the creation that occurs both spiritually and physically. This is stated most explicitly in Moses, chapter 3, a restored account of the creation that Joseph Smith gave to make abundantly clear that plants and animals are living souls and as such have a right to joy and posterity and the right to exist to fulfill implicit and divine purpose. And I'll just read from a few of those verses in chapter 3. Every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, I created all things of which I have spoken spiritually before they were naturally upon the face of the earth. For I, the Lord God, had not caused it to rain upon the face of the earth. And I, the Lord God, had created all the children of men, and yet not a man to till the ground, for in heaven I created them. And there was not yet flesh upon the earth, neither in the water, neither in the air. And out of the ground I, the Lord God, made to grow every tree naturally that is pleasant to the sight of man, and man could behold it. And it became also a living soul, for it was spiritual in the day that I created it. For it remained in the sphere in which I, God, created it. I continue to believe that this is one of the most significant doctrines to never receive any environmental attention by church leaders, and only a few attempts by scholars. It is, moreover, utterly irrelevant to day-to-day life for most Latter-day Saints. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never heard a Sunday school discussion of what that might mean. Even though a shift to what we variously call vitalism today or neo-animism has been one of the most significant shifts in global philosophy and theology in light of the environmental crisis. This change is because hardly anything seems more important to inspire respect for the environment than some conception of the spiritual and inherent value and even sacred quality of the physical world. The world's various forms of animism in indigenous traditions throughout the globe imply the spiritual and sacred personality of physical life and present the possibility of divine immanence and a this-worldly ethics of responsibility. Many scholars have argued that when Christianity departed from its own animistic ideas, or at least rejected the animism of neighboring cultures, that this facilitated and even justified the degradation of the physical world. And there is scarcely any version of Christian ecotheology today that doesn't try to rescue the idea of spirit in nature in some form or another. And yet there is scarcely any version of such a theology that has a more explicit and clear indication of the basis for such a belief than we have in the verses I just read to you. So that's point number one. A second doctrine that I think is very important is the embodiment of God and the earth as the site of the celestial kingdom. The incarnation of God in the form of Jesus Christ in Christianity has long played an important role in many eco-theologies to justify the respect and attention it signals that we ought to pay to the physical world. It is a reminder not to look to the spiritual realm alone as the source of inspiration or of higher value or even of human aspiration, but to remember that this life, this body, and this realm are spheres of spiritual promise and are worthy of God's presence. Mormonism, of course, famously takes this to another level with the embodiment of God the Father himself. That is, the incarnation of Jesus is not just a temporary instantiation of the divine in the flesh, but is, in LDS theology, a reflection of a deeper and more eternal relation between physical matter and spirit. The highest sphere of divine existence is embodied, and the highest location of an exalted destiny is this earth. In Doctrine and Covenants 93, for example, we read that the elements are eternal, and spirit and element inseparably connected receive a fullness of joy. And when separated, man cannot receive a fullness of joy. So although I welcome the obvious environmental implications of such a doctrine, I recognize, however, that it has a tendency to inspire exactly the opposite of earth care. It can imply, for example, that what we do to the earth little matters since it all resurrects and obtains a state of perfection beyond this life. I've certainly heard students at BYU from time to time say something like, the earth's going to die anyway, what's the point? Or it's going to resurrect anyway, so what's the point? I just bother to point out to them, then why aren't you smoking and taking drugs right now? You're going to get a perfectly beautiful body when you're all done. Go for it. Facetiously said, of course. When transcendence and immanence become confused with one another, this is an interesting theological problem. It's sometimes not clear which gets the upper hand, right? But nevertheless, I believe it matters to say that Latter-day Saints are not aspiring to go to another planet or sphere, but to obtain the privilege to stay put. I love that concept. I think that's really beautiful. Mormonism has a tendency to scramble traditional theological categories, as exemplified by these verses, which are among my very favorite, that simultaneously describe divine transcendence or theism, God as creator over and above the creation and beyond any physical location, divine immanence or panentheism, God in and through but still encompassing the physical realm, and divine embodiment in all physical life, or pantheism, God as the body of the earth. Hear these verses from section 88. This is the light of Christ, as also he is in the Son, and the light of the sun, and the power thereof by which it was made. The power thereof by which it was made sounds to me like transcendence, but if he is the Son, then it sounds like pantheism, and if he's in the Son, panentheism. As also he is in the moon and is the light of the moon and the power thereof by which it was made, as also the light of the stars and the power thereof by which they were made, and the earth also and the power thereof, even the earth upon which you stand. And the light which shineth, notice how this light shifts in metaphorical meaning in some really fascinating ways. The light which shineth, which giveth you light, is through him who enlighteneth your eyes, which is the same light that quickeneth your understanding, which light proceedeth forth from the presence of God to fill the immensity of space. That light which is in all things, which giveth life to all things, which is the law by which all things are governed, even the power of God, who sitteth upon his throne, who is in the midst of all things. So the light is both physical light, it's spiritual light, and God keeps sort of moving. It's almost like the uncertainty principle in physics. It is probably best to imagine these as expressing these verses as expressing panentheism, which is a position that the verses gesture to both the idea of divine transcendence and God as nature, but only to then suggest that divinity cannot be equated, but neither can it be radically differentiated from physical light. I'm trying to suggest that I like that ambiguity. As many eco-theologians have argued, the advantage of a panentheistic theology is that it positions divine sovereignty above nature, but not so transcendent that divine activity becomes indiscernible in the workings of life here, and not so unable to transcend life on earth that divine will must be equated with all that nature does. An overly transcendent God and a purely pantheistic God both run the same risk. That is a risk of apathy in the face of human and nature-caused suffering. I'll say more about that later. Third doctrine is that God values biodiversity and wishes all life to flourish. Latter-day Saint theology clearly embraces the value of all life on earth. Many eco-theologians have argued that such value is expressed in the book of Genesis, where biodiversity seems to get a nod. These verses from the first chapter, 20 to 22, God commands the waters to bring forth fishes and fowl abundantly, to fill the waters and the air, and he further commands the beasts themselves to multiply and replenish. Those are the same commands, of course, that are given to humankind, and that seems to suggest an embrace of the value of all life and the value of preserving biodiversity, presumably to find some sort of balance between all of this reproduction, right? Now, what's interesting is that I think Mormonism does this one better. As we learned from the endowment ceremony given by Joseph Smith and from other teachings, beasts of all kinds are blessed to fulfill the measure of their creation, which is described as in the right to joy in posterity, that is the right to reproduce, right, to flourish. Mormonism has similarly preached universal resurrection, including animals, making it one of the most animal-friendly theologies in the Christian world. Number 4, we must eat with the earth in mind. And this is my reading of Doctrine and Covenants 89, the famous section known as the Word of Wisdom. In these verses, we read about God's concern not just about human health, but for the health and nourishment of all of his creations. These are verses that never get mentioned, again, in Sunday school lessons, but I'll read from that section. Yea, also flesh of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I, the Lord, have ordained for the use of man with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly, and it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used, only in times of winter or of cold or famine. All grain is ordained for the use of man and of beast, to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven, and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. That seems pretty all-encompassing. These verses remind the reader of God's attention to all of his creations in the economy of the creation. This sounds very similar to what God lectures Job about in chapter 38 of Job, reminding him that he's paying a lot of attention to stuff that Job has never seen and knows nothing about. And what this is indicating to me is that our eating must take place in that broader context, which is why it seems to stress eating meat sparingly and eating fruits and vegetables in season. These principles are compatible with eating lower on the food chain, as environmentalists advocate today, and eating local, two principles that eco-theologians have long argued have remarkable benefits for the earth. Fifth and final doctrine is we are accountable for how we use the earth's resources. This is what we know in the restored gospel as the law of consecration. I don't think we can find any verse in the Bible that expresses the principle of stewardship as clearly as it's laid out in section 59, which Bishop Causset gave some attention to in his General Conference talk. Yea, all things which come of the earth in the season thereof are made for the benefit and the use of man, both to please the eye and gladden the heart, for food and for raiment, for taste and for smell, to strengthen the body and to enliven the soul. I often find it significant that those verses, before I go on, indicate the aesthetic value of the natural world before the utilitarian value is mentioned. It pleaseth God that he hath given all these things unto man, for unto this end were they made to be used with judgment, not to excess, neither by extortion. I like a more succinct version of this in section 49. Woe be unto man that sheddeth blood, or that wasteth flesh, and hath no need. I think that's a pretty profound principle. Curiously, Latter-day Saints have rarely mentioned these verses until more recently, but have instead a longer history of quoting from section 104 whenever environmental concerns have come up in the culture. And I'm speaking somewhat anecdotally here from my own personal experience. I recognize that maybe it's different in different parts of the country, different parts of the church, internationally. But these verses from section 104 have been given some attention with regard to the environmental movement early on, when the environmental movement, especially in the 1980s, was focused quite a bit on population control. And the phrase that I'm thinking of is, there is enough and to spare. That phrase has been used both by church leaders and locally to simply say that the concerns of environmentalism are extreme, or perhaps not faithful enough, not trusting enough in God's purposes. My personal assessment is that those efforts probably sort of gave a bad word to the word sustainability. I know I experienced that at BYU when I first got there. The word seemed to be almost taboo, and I was trying to figure out why it was a problematic term until I had this kind of longer history explained to me. And Elder Faust had given a speech at BYU in the 1980s, in which, I think it was in the 80s or early 90s, in which he had said essentially that he thought that phrase put to rest the concerns about population. He wasn't addressing the entire question of environmental stewardship, but in the 1980s, environmentalism was very focused on population, much more so than it is today, and that was essentially what he was addressing. But that kind of just gave the word a stigma, right? And it made it very difficult for some time to talk about it, about the principle of sustainability. A careful reading of the verses in the larger context, I think, makes it hard to argue that these verses justify anti-environmental attitudes, since it is actually a revelation precisely dedicated, quote, to making every man accountable as a steward over earthly blessings. So it's very clearly arguing for a sense of stewardship. We're accountable for something, so then the question is, what are we accountable for? And the Lord provides a clear answer. The only way, he says, that there is enough and to spare is if we learn to exalt the poor and make the rich low. That is, if we learn to more equitably distribute Earth's resources. Environmental problems are, to a large degree, problems of inequitable distribution of resources. So this revelation, to me, seems spot on. Quote, therefore, if any man take of the abundance which I have made, and impart not his portion according to the law of my gospel unto the poor and the needy, he shall with the wicked lift up his eyes in hell, being in torment. Now, those are not my words. Those words terrify me. I don't think this revelation is anything but, I think it's anything but reassuring, and certainly inspired, because as we continue to wrestle with equitable distribution of resources throughout the world. So now I want to consider why the resistance, to the degree that it's still something that we're hesitating to embrace. There are, I think, two historical explanations that are the most plausible, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but and Matt's the historian, so he can field all history questions afterwards. But LDS attitudes about the environment were shaped in the early years by an experience of freedom from U.S. governmental interference. And so the idea today of regulation of our interaction with an environment, especially one that Latter-day Saint settlers had nurtured a relationship with for generations, strikes right at the heart of that experience. It threatens it, and it seems to want to deny that history. And often, frankly, environmentalists have denied Latter-day Saint history of persecution and so on. And it denies the wisdom and the freedom that were earned in those places. So it's not coincidence, however, that attitudes in LDS culture are not unlike other areas in the Intermountain West, where similar struggles with federal interference with large swaths of public land have shaped the contemporary political landscape. A second reason is that attitudes about the environment have been more aggressively shaped in recent decades, there's lots of research on this, by political affiliation than by any other factor. So religion is lower on the list of reasons why people have the environmental attitudes that they do. The number one reason, or the number one determining factor, is which party you belong to. And that's because since roughly the 1980s, there's been quite a polarization between the two parties, and one of the consequences of that polarization is that the environment became the proprietary ownership of the Democrats, and Republicans went in a different direction. So it's become much more difficult for people who affiliate as Republicans to understand their own sense of environmental care. So it's also made it almost by definition political to talk about environmental issues. I've experienced this repeatedly throughout my life, so I can certainly share experiences about that. But it's a major reason, I think, that the church felt hesitant to figure out how do we enter into this discussion without looking political. And I am glad to see that the church has finally seen fit to move forward with bold moral language that talks in terms of principles and values that transcend party. So both of these explanations suggest that theology, unfortunately, plays a much smaller role than we would like to believe, at least those of us who are scholars of theology. I kind of want to think that theology makes a huge difference. And I don't mean to say that theology doesn't matter or that nothing can be done to change attitudes within the church, but it does at least give us pause in assuming that the problem simply goes away once scholars start writing about it or the church starts preaching stewardship as a core principle. We must be careful not to pay too much attention to what the institution of the church does or says or doesn't do or doesn't say, or to definitions of right belief. We should instead seek to understand what members do with the doctrines they have and why. And I'm persuaded by a lot of social science that I've read on this subject that Lowell Bennion was correct when he argued that belief matters to the degree that it can find application in lived experience. To the degree that our doctrines remain merely theoretical, even if they are preached with some frequency, they will remain without influence on our behavior. We need more points of contact with these teachings in the home, in Sunday school, over the chapel pulpit, and in general conference. We need friends to say that this matters. We need authority figures to say that it matters. We need stories and examples of environmental stewardship in action from members of the church. We need activities in church settings where we practice stewardship in concrete ways and talk about that that's what we're doing, either through service projects, ward activities, training for families and individuals to help identify effective strategies for their daily lives as a spiritual principle. Short of this, I fear that the change will either continue to be glacially slow or non-existent. Now, I will always welcome more talk of the doctrines, however, but only because I think at some point some members grow tired enough of all the talk to want to take some meaningful action. When that happens, the doctrines become alive and relevant enough to contemporary lived experience to make an adventure of the life of faith. If this never happens, Mormonism will continue to lose its grip on younger generations, and I fear will render itself irrelevant in the 21st century. Now, having said all that, that won't stop me from making one more theological observation about one LDS doctrine of the creation that has lain in neglect for almost the entirety of our tradition. I was asked to come here to speak of theology, and this is an academic conversation after all, so let me examine one more doctrine critically. I'm speaking of the creation out of unorganized matter. The predominant assumption in Christianity, even among the vast majority of Christian eco-theologians, is that the creation is out of nothing. This has been, of course, accepted dogma for centuries and is one of the less cited reasons that Latter-day Saints have been identified as heretics by those invested in policing the borders of true Christianity. I will note, however, that a few eco-theologians, especially in process and open theology, seem less inclined to protect the ex nihilo thesis precisely because it doesn't fit as well with what we know about the Earth's history, the laws of physics, and the story of evolution. If we want an eco-theology that is at least responsive to what we know about the workings of the world, it seems odd that eco-theology clings to a thesis that is more and more untenable. I have written more extensively about the ex materia, or the creation out of unorganized matter, in my chapter, The Economy of the Creation, in my book, The Hope of Nature. So I don't want to repeat my argument here in its entirety. But the sum of what I argue is that the doctrine of an ex materia creation continues to be somewhat of an embarrassment to us, in part because we struggle to reconcile it with the idea of a personal God, an interventionist God who has the power to perform miracles that seem to defy natural law, to move history, and to relieve suffering. Mormonism, as I said before, is a fascinating theological scramble. The scramble seems to be that we have an immanent God, a transcendent God, and a God who can be seen and touched all in one. A God who can speak to a boy in a grove of trees in the flesh is also a God who apparently could not create all matter, but has instead had to adopt a more collaborative and cooperative posture vis-a-vis the material world in order to midwife the emergence of life on this planet. Most theologians, now that's what I suppose, I don't know, but if evolution is true and I accept the theory of evolution, then that's what I have to assume. Most theologians reject ex materia creation because of the way it seems to proscribe a personal God and the way in which it limits divine power and thus limits our trust in divine providence. It's no wonder that the theologies that espouse a creation ex materia, the LDS tradition excluded, tend to argue for a much less personal God as a result. Our doctrine and religious culture continue to insist on the personal and intervening nature of God. So if there is some balance to find between ex materia creation on the one hand and personal intervening God on the other, we haven't found it yet. Now, I personally think that the link is God's compassion. The weeping God that Eugene England and Terrell and Fiona Gibbons and Elder Holland and others have spoken to. God's compassion may be the most important expression of his personality and intimacy with human experience. And such compassion makes the most sense in a theology in which he is not the cause of every breeze, every shudder of the wind, or every shudder of the earth, or every storm. However, because the ex materia creation seems to suggest a different kind of power and modus operandi for divine sovereignty than that insisted on by the ex nihilo thesis, we have largely put the doctrine aside. If not, in some cases, we have seen outright condemned efforts, condemnations of efforts to give the doctrine too much attention. That was the fate of Sterling McMurrin in his fascinating study of the doctrine. And I don't remember the timing of this, but later, of course, Bruce R. McConkie made it clear that speculation about any limits on God's power would not be tolerated in the church, as one of the 7 deadly heresies, if I'm remembering correctly. And the bottom line is that we haven't been able to articulate exactly what difference this doctrine makes, even as we rightly continue to celebrate the doctrines that suggest God's capacity for miracles. Now, one of the main reasons why open and process theologians are intrigued by this ex materia creation idea is that it has important implications for ethics and our willingness to take responsibility for life on earth and for its health. I am persuaded by this thesis. It could, in other words, truly advance our efforts to care for the planet, but it may be the one almost subconscious reason why Latter-day Saints continue to hesitate to embrace stewardship. Let me explain. When we examine the main theological arguments of climate skeptics, as I have spent a considerable amount of time doing, their tendency is to suggest that the fact of anthropogenic climate change contradicts the idea of an omnipotent creator in whose hand the future lies. And I can talk more at length about that if you're interested. But there is no way human behavior can violate his will, which is by definition in such a theology the direction of history, that we're sort of obligated to believe that the direction of history as we see it is both inevitable and desirable. There is, in other words, a profound complacency at the root of such denial, using trust in God as an excuse for our faults and refusing to believe that it might matter or make a difference to take a different direction in our behavior or in history, collectively. It is amazing to me the many sorts of human flaws we are willing to abdicate and then attribute to God. I have certainly heard such logic among Latter-day Saint faithful who feel it's somehow a lack of faith to believe that we might have created a catastrophe that we could have avoided or at least still should try to avoid. Now, Voltaire, of course, famously identified the ethical weakness of this philosophy in his character, Dr. Pangloss, who believed that this was always and forever the best of all possible worlds, no matter what form the world might take. Voltaire's classic, Candide, was in response to the great earthquake in Lisbon in 1755 that killed hundreds of thousands and was seen by many as an expression of God's will. A creation ex nihilo, of course, famously creates this problem of trying to make theological sense of human and natural suffering by justifying it and thus attributing to God characteristics that hardly seem benevolent or just. An ex materia creation doesn't make such attributions, at least not necessary, as McMurrin wisely noted a generation ago. Of course, an ex materia creation isn't exactly comforting, and this is more to my point. A fact that perhaps explains our ambivalence about it. The idea of an ex materia creation lays bare the fact of suffering, accident, and chaos that lies at the heart of the systems of the earth that move life forward. And our story of evolution certainly makes that clear. A deep geological history of the earth tells us that millions upon millions of years, species on this planet have suffered tremendously, and millions have gone extinct before human beings even showed up, leading one really intelligent theologian to conclude that the only way God could be just in such a universe is that there is a universal resurrection. Bad things happen in this world, but without them, good things don't happen either. Beauty and horror seem to go together, as Annie Dillard famously noted. Nature follows its laws. Children skip and play, and some trip and fall down stairs and impale themselves to death on a piece of metal. Veterans, these are true stories, veterans celebrate in parades meant to honor them, but some were once killed by a train in the middle of the parade. Satellites make it possible for me to see my grandson every day on my iPhone, but metal from a satellite once fell and killed a child in a field in Mexico. I could go on, of course, and the true stories of earthly horrors are no less numerous than the small miracles we focus on in church. And I'm not saying that one is more true than the other. All I'm saying is that and I'm not saying that grace or mercy are mirages. I'm instead inclined to believe, with King Benjamin, that my very existence and capacity for breath is itself a miracle. That you and I are survivors of a Holocaust that takes each one of us, either one by one or sometimes en masse, but takes us all the same. This day, my very life, the fact that I'm alive and breathing, is a brief period of grace. A sense of living in such a chancy cosmos should fill us with great appreciation and gratitude. And it does shift the challenge from trying to make sense of matter to trying to make sense of God. Whereas we used to hold nature captive by theology for most of human history, now it seems we can't accept God at all, or at least a benevolent and healing one in light of nature's laws. And I'm speaking of our society at large. I personally do not believe contemporary science proscribes God, but I also don't believe I do him any favors by upholding a God who would be offended by the findings of geology or evolution or climate science or any other seemingly incompatible data point that we seem to gain about the world. And secularization, of course, was in large part motivated by the challenges that science posed to religion. But secularization has run its course, according to many philosophers today, and neo-animism is on the rise, and theologies are emerging that are doing this hard work for us. But Latter-day Saints are not part of the conversation and barely seem to be aware of it. To rescue religion from secularism, however, we cannot afford to bypass the challenge and revert to old theologies that stand in opposition to material reality. And Latter-day Saints don't have to, even though the difficulties have thus far inspired more denial and scientific ignorance, that more creative theologies that are theologies that are responsive to science. It might be true that trust in divine sovereignty is harder to come by in a more open and unpredictable universe, but rather than seeing this as a problem, we might consider that it also makes trust more meaningful, precisely because it involves some wager on our part. Faith itself is a wager, and to believe instead in a perfectly rational God who, even if his reasoning is different from ours, is nevertheless always detectable and explainable, is to obviate faith entirely. Faith, then, is made more meaningful precisely because of the way in which it pushes against perception and interpretation of reality, precisely in the way that it doesn't depend on a theological explanation or a rational one. Brigham Young once said that we should pray as if everything depended on God and act as if everything depended on us. Well, which is it? As I wrote in my essay, The Economy of the Creation, LDS theology seems to suggest three realities simultaneously. Everything depends on divine will, everything depends on human agency, and everything depends on natural law, all at once. You can never pull one of those blocks out of the Jenga tower of faith without it collapsing. I see meaning, as I have implied, in this confusion. It makes my faith responsive to the possibility of God's will being different than mine, which seems to be an obvious need in any theology. It also makes my faith responsive to the possibility of the earth and nature acting in ways that we cannot predict or control, and responsive to the fact that I am accountable and responsible to make the world better and to mitigate suffering. It also makes me appreciate God's compassion and suffering on my behalf, but more importantly, on behalf of the entire creation. All right, I've probably said enough. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. Lisa Sedaris, who's an ecotheologian, has argued that ecotheology, as promising as it has been, has tended to motivate believers to care for a natural world that doesn't exist. What she means by that is that it has simplified and romanticized an idea of nature as harmonious and balanced, as Edenic, when in fact the story of the natural world as we understand it from evolution is a very, very violent story, and it's prone to accident, and in fact seems to depend upon accident and chaos to generate life. So it's not an easy world in which to craft an easy eco-theology. And I think her point is fair. But if we need a theology to be responsive to evolutionary science, and one that confronts this darker aspect or more troubling aspect of nature, but we also want one that incentivizes care, that's a challenge, right? Because you could look at evolution, or you could look at climate change, or you could look at deep time and say, what difference does it make? It doesn't make any difference at all, so I'm just going to throw up my hands. I think we have this kind of opportunity in the LDS tradition. Nature is both a gift and a force that resists our will. It is a creation of God, but it is also in many ways, but it is also in ways we do not fully understand, resistant to divine will itself. This behooves believers, I think, to act in humility and on principle, rather than with the expectation of a particular outcome. Much of the frustration people have with climate change is the implication that we have created consequences that are disproportionate to our intentions. If I'm driving my mother to the hospital, I'm emitting carbon. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a relationship between my act of service and the damage I'm doing to the earth. Climate change is a truly wicked problem, and if it isn't always obvious what to do, faith in a creator who sees the problem and yet still believes in our capacity as problem solvers inspires the hard work to seek, try, and continually revise our efforts. This kind of work is an expression of respect for natural reality, but also a supernatural faith that we must wager our hope on the basis of revealed principles and ideals that promote modesty, reverence, compassion, and equity. So I think Lisa Sedaris is right that it is a myth that a healthy natural world means balance or harmony that won't involve death and violence and unnecessary random events. Many theologies imagine that God's power was potent enough to defeat or exclude chaos, but an ex materia creation suggests God's power is made manifest in the way it partnered with chaos. His power repurposes chaos and accident. His power, in other words, is not entirely transcendent of physical matter, but neither is it reduced to or by it. In this, I see a principle we would do well to be governed by. We can take the principles of our gospel to the bank, as it were, and live modestly, generously, with judgment and care for how we use natural resources, and we can and should do so out of respect for God's offspring, as well as for all of his creations, knowing that this is our stewardship, as Bishop Cosset so eloquently expressed last month. Thank you.
Thank you, George. We have about half an hour for questions. So feel free to just raise your hand, and George, feel free as you like.
Thank you. Please.
Well, of course, part of this is personal. It affects all of us personally. Looking at the LDS culture, looking at particularly the agricultural or the rural roots of many Latter-day Saints. It's urban now, but 40 years ago it was much less urban than it is now. So you have a lot of Latter-day Saints who have roots on the farm, such as me. And we certainly know the cycles of nature. We certainly know about caring for nature so that it will continue to produce. And it seems to me that that kind of rural or agricultural background should have led to a tremendous respect for nature.
Yeah.
And then one other point, Boy Scouts, we don't have it anymore. But Boy Scouts certainly taught care for the environment, and up until a few years ago, all of my boys were taught those very important principles. Leave no trace, just some things like that engender appreciation for the environment. So you try to articulate why you think the Latter-day Saint culture, particularly the Mountain West, doesn't appreciate environmentalism. But on a basic level, we should be among the most sensitive to the environment. So why do you see that is not more universally apparent in today's urban church? Have they lost contact with the land and the urban environment, or what?
Well, that's certainly one of the, I think, biggest reasons why conversation about stewardship in church teachings by church leaders kind of drops out. Because in the 19th century, management of water sources and conflicts over water and humane care of animals, there was actually a Humane Day for 20 years in primary that Joseph F. Smith created to teach primary kids to treat animals humanely. Such a program wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? Unless it became about eating, which would make a lot of sense, frankly, but it was more obvious to people in their lived experience that there were principles of the gospel that applied, right? And this is not at all unique to Mormonism. I mean, and because the whole country was unsettled, as Wendell Berry has written about quite eloquently in his book, The Unsettling of America. It's sort of about the loss of the agricultural tradition and loss of sense of place, a loss of that appreciation for weather and soil and the need to be taking good care of a system, right? Because everything is now automated, and I'm going to go to the grocery store, I'm going to buy things shrink wrapped, and I don't know where they came from, I don't know what kind of life they represent. So there's a tremendous problem, globally, but certainly in our country, where that uprooting from the land has caused us to have to develop a different kind of environmentalism, or a different kind of care. And what's kind of curious, though, is that you see strong environmental care among most urban cultures in the United States today. In Utah, you see it much more along the Wasatch Front than you do in rural Utah. So it's almost the opposite of what you would expect. But that's, I think, a false lens, because if we say, well, nobody in a rural community hates nature, right? What they hate, or if they're angry about environmentalism, it's because they're resisting a global force that is actually uprooting their culture, right? It's taking them away from their land. And so it's actually because of attachment to land that they resent environmentalism, which tells me that, environmentalists, if we're going to be effective in reaching all cultures and all peoples, we've got to understand the history that has formed certain attitudes, and understand that whatever resistance that different people have to environmental stewardship, it's probably more a problem of language, common language and common understanding, than it is a lack of commitment to caring for nature. I am optimistic about this. I think nature is a universal language. The love of nature is as universal as music. And most anybody has some capacity to respond to the natural world and to appreciate it, even if they don't consider themselves religious or spiritual. They have an attachment to it that could be described as a kind of spiritual experience. And that's the kind of common experience that I think we should focus on, rather than a lot of the isms or the political ideologies. Is just sort of I was part of a couple of efforts years ago where we did talk to rural and Wasatch Front people about their love of the natural world, and just focusing on, tell us about your family experiences in the natural world, and when was your love of nature first stimulated? It immediately unifies people. And people who normally see themselves as on the other side of some divide suddenly realize that this is actually a common feeling. So that's one reason why I place a lot of hope in the fact that if we got really practical about it rather than ideological, and we just started exercising and practicing stewardship and talked about it as such, it would probably go a long way in breaking down some of those resistances that really have nothing to do with the natural world and have more to do with ideology and territory that various people are trying to protect. But it's a bigger problem in the sense that if we no longer have scouting, I mean, the big advantage is that young women, of course, were excluded from scouting. So getting more young men and young women now out, maybe if not in the formal program of pursuing a merit badge, but actually taking advantage of those experiences to teach principles about the creation and about stewardship. I try to do that. I always pull out that section 88 in the stars whenever I go camping with kids, and just let's look up for a second and pause and think about what's happening here, because the other enemy is this thing, right? And computer screens. And so kids they don't even know the language of natural love of nature anymore. They don't know yet what it's like to experience wonder or feel diminished by nature in a healing way. But they can be taught. I mean, I don't think it takes a whole lot. I was a camper at the Lowell Bennion's Boys Ranch up in Victor, Idaho. There were no cell phones back then, so there was nothing to uproot me from. But I had no choice but to sort of confront the natural world, and it terrified me. Actually, it wasn't just all beauty. It was like, I almost felt like I was on the verge of being struck by lightning a couple of times. Almost had my head knocked off. I was riding a horse. But all of that was extraordinarily transformative for me, and I worry that kids don't get enough of that. Not that they should feel they're about to be decapitated on a horse, but yeah.
Hey, George, you talk, as does the Gospel Topics conservation piece, on Genesis. How do you place the fall in terms of both how that deals with stewardship? I suspect, well, there was never a film early in the temple, but the notion of what the post-fall looked like, sure looked like Utah, and this notion of going from dressing the earth to kind of muscling
aspens,
it.
They have to have aspens in
They got to have aspens. But moving from dressing the earth, which has one connotation, to muscling it and being in combat with it. I don't know if it fit with their notion of taking a place that was kind of God-forsaken and creating something from it, change their view of how they live with nature as opposed to harmonious. And does that reflect perhaps how we as Latter-day Saints have approached notions of how you tend the earth as opposed to wrestling?
Oh, I love that question. And in fact, it probably should have been a sixth doctrinal point, that the idea of a fortunate fall that Mormonism so clearly embraces, right? That this was a positive development, it wasn't a punishment, or to the degree that it's a condition of mortality to bring children forth in suffering and have to sweat and work and toil in order to reproduce and feed ourselves. In a fortunate fall theology like ours, those are redemptive activities. They're not punishments, right? And in a fortunate fall, I mean, there is some language in the temple and in our scripture that imply certainly the fallenness of this world, but another way to read that is that there is no, especially if we always remember the celestial kingdom is this earth, there is no escaping this planet, right? It's all about transforming, and it's an inner transformation and a transformation of one's relationship to God that reveals heaven in the present. That's how I like to think of it. That's how I understand a fortunate fall theology. It's really about sort of the scales falling from our eyes and realizing that, I mean, because honestly, I hike all the time in Aspen, and I often think to myself, if this isn't heaven, I don't want to go. You know, like if this isn't there, I don't want to go. I don't know what they're offering, but if it's not Aspens in the fall, I don't know. I don't care. And I'm only being half facetious. I really feel that very strongly, and I think we all do on some level when we get attached to natural beauty. It's heartbreaking to think about leaving it, right? And so that's a beautiful principle to think about in terms of, you know, most of the criticisms of religion, especially Western religion, I should be clear about that. Most of the criticisms of Western religion and monotheistic traditions is that they made the mistake of placing too much value in some other sphere. And I think they're right. I mean, you know, just placing the spirit over the body is more important, heaven over the earth is more important. And when you push those dichotomies too far, you end up with some really problematic theologies. And that's what I love about how Mormonism just keeps like never allowing you to separate those things easily, and almost, I think, almost literally asks you to think, okay, heaven is here now, right? That doesn't mean that it can't be a sort of another sphere or a future realization of godly promise, but I do think the principle of learning how to make heaven here now is really what's fundamental to our theology. And it doesn't just apply to environmental stewardship, of course, it applies to social relationships, right? We understand from the law of consecration that our ability to learn how to live as communities of equals is really going to determine what kind of heaven we're capable of. Yeah.
Kind of addressing some of this hesitancy within our Mormon culture sometimes towards environmental stewardship. It seems obvious that there is a lot of political association kind of with the environmentalism topic that can be troublesome and problematic, but there also seems to be some things that I can't help but remember some of the things that were taught in the past about 6,000-year Earth, or in Doctrines of Salvation, kind of resistance to the evolution topic. And to what extent does that still play into how people resist scientific topics in general?
That's a good question, and Matt, you may have some thoughts on that. I don't know. I can speak anecdotally about my experience at BYU, and I don't teach science, obviously, but I do have lots of colleagues who do, and I've team taught with a number of evolutionary scientists and team teaching with a plant geneticist right now who's teaching our class all about plant evolution, and it's pretty exciting. And I've noticed a shift in students that there's less resistance and less nervousness about it. It doesn't seem to be this big symbolic battle that it maybe once was. But that being said, you know, we're an interesting religious tradition in this sense. I mean, you know, I'm sure many of you have experienced that moment where you're in a conversation with somebody and they find out, for those of you who are LDS, you know, they find out you're a member of the church. For me, it's, oh, you teach at BYU, isn't that like Oral Roberts or something? And they confuse me with a certain way of being Christian that I personally go, oh, no, you know, like that. And that's not really fair. It's not fair to people at Oral Roberts, it's not fair to BYU, but I have to explain to people, you know, we've been teaching evolution at BYU for like 100 years, you know, or more. And that's not to say that it hasn't been without controversy, right? And you've alluded to some of those controversies. But the teaching has continued. It's never stopped. And there seems to be much less nervousness about it than ever before. So I do think that's a positive change. But I often encounter a lot of scientific illiteracy on evolution among students and among my peers in the church. I don't think it's something that maybe a lot of Latter-day Saints feel a little uncomfortable reading about it or getting more versed in it. I find it utterly fascinating and exciting, and the theologies that go with it blow my mind even more, and that's when I get more and more excited about my faith. So it's never actually created any tensions at all for me, quite the opposite. And I kind of want to express that passion and enthusiasm to encourage people to not be afraid. That's what I was alluding to when I said we sort of revert back to older theologies that other Christians have used. They're not our theologies. Like, you know, so when we back up against a wall and say, I don't want to accept evolution, or I don't want to accept climate science, or whatever else it might be, we're often using a theology that is not reflective of our doctrines. And I was alluding to the creation out of unorganized matter as an example of that. The problems get, I mean, you know, it gets tricky when you start saying, okay, well, what does that mean about Adam and Eve? You know, we take Adam and Eve pretty darn literally, and the way I understand that, or I explain to students, is I don't know what else to do but to take Adam and Eve literally. Like, I just know that when I take them literally, all kinds of beautiful things happen. But I also don't think for a second that God is going to condemn every human being who existed prior to 6,000 years ago. There are millions of them for millions of years, right? So it's like we don't have a right to sort of throw our ancestors under the bus when we're a religion that believes in our ancestors. But I don't, you know, these are just areas that are very speculative and very gray, and they're kind of on the edges of our theology. But I think I don't think that it matters that much that, you know, a student has to come to certain convictions about the age of the earth. I do think it's deeply problematic to believe that it's 6,000 years old. That seems to fly in the face of everything. But if people say to me, I don't understand evolution, or I don't really like what it means, I think they should just explore what is the source of the unsettled feeling, and read as widely as you can, because there's no question that some scientists, some very vocal and very famous, world famous, like Dawkins and others, have made a case that evolution makes religion ridiculous, right? And that no intelligent person could possibly believe in God. But if that's the only snippet you catch, and that's what you assume, and you bypass all these beautiful books being written by Christian thinkers who believe in evolution, that's a pity, right? Because of one loud and sort of culture war kind of conversation. That's the impoverishment of our discourse these days, is that we sort of hear these sound bites and then we assume that they shape the whole story. And I just think, you know, we can be more creative and more faithful to our tradition than that. I don't know, that was kind of a scrambled answer.
No, that's a great
question. Yeah.
You mentioned at some point in your talk about, I think, like positive changes you feel like you've seen from the institutional church in terms of thinking about stewardship in recent times. One thing that comes to mind is Elder Cosse's talk, of course, which you referenced. That felt like a big moment. What are some other like positive changes in just talking about stewardship and environmentalism that you feel like you've seen from the institutional church recently? And I guess what else would you look for to create like more touch points for talking about stewardship?
Well, let me answer that last question first, and by saying, I don't know if you know Katharine Hayhoe. She's a very famous climate scientist who's an evangelical. She's the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. She's speaking at BYU in 2 weeks. Very exciting. And she's written a beautiful book called Saving Us, and it's all about climate, and she speaks the language of Christians in America. She's very, very charming and articulate and incredibly enthusiastic. And she just breaks down all kinds of barriers because she doesn't shame anybody. And her thesis is we have to talk about the environment. We have to talk about climate. We've got to talk about the things that we're dealing with. And she puts a lot of faith in conversations. And right now, BYU students are tracking their conversations about the climate in advance of her visit. And I think they're at like 10,000 conversations. I'm going to count all of you as a conversation about the climate because we have a little counter that we can enter our data. So she's a big believer in just, the things that maybe we're suppressing. Let's just come out and talk about it, right? And let's ask questions and let's explore together. The longer answer to your first part, or your first question, is that, and I can only speak anecdotally, but I feel like I've had some front row seats to a couple of things. I was part of a presentation to the Quorum of the 12 about 7 years ago about climate change. They were incredibly responsive. They were not, denying it, or the focus was the anticipated impact of climate change on the poor and the world religious response to climate change. So climate scientists presented the science, and I helped prepare the material about the global religious response. I have met with a handful of apostles, with leaders of the Nature Conservancy. Catherine Hayhoe will be meeting with Elder Christofferson and possibly Bishop Cossé, or I think it's actually one of Bishop Cossé's counselors, because I think he can't be there when she comes to BYU. And those have been beautiful. They've been really moving experiences. I do know that Bishop Cossé's office at the presiding bishopric has hired somebody to help put together a sustainability plan for the church. I've been a part of some of those conversations. I think when I've had the opportunity to say something, and I don't say this to be, undermining of the church effort or anything, but I felt very strongly that when the church needed to understand the risk of losing our youth if we don't do more about this, because it's something that young people really care about, and it's a real opportunity for the church, to put it in utilitarian terms, to capture that energy in a positive way, and that there's a lot of bad theology out there, and it's dangerous, right? And that the messaging is not there, and the church, every conversation I've had, going back to Elder Nash's talk in 2013, a bunch of LDS people talked to him after that, and that the result was that Gospel Topics essay on conservation and stewardship. So the church responds knowing that they've got a messaging problem. I think they're still trying to fix it. I don't know how extensive the fixes will be, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if we saw a rollout of some improvements in the curriculum. I mean, the beauty of an online touch of your phone curriculum is that they can make changes right away, and it doesn't have to involve printing another, thousands and thousands of manuals. So these changes can happen relatively quickly, and I would expect to see them. The church is now being more vocal about their own practices. These have been going on forever, but for some reason, BYU is the same way. It's like there was this weird humility going on. Well, we don't want to brag about the stuff we're doing. I'm like, no, I want you to brag. You brag about other things. You can brag about this. Like, we brag about our football team. Why can't we brag about the fact that BYU is doing some good with their recycling, right? What's the danger of the hubris there? But the church office building is heated by geothermal energy. That's really cool. I didn't know that. That was like said to me in some private meeting once, and I was like, why isn't that like in the headlines? That was from the get-go. The church has this really cutting-edge sustainable ranching practice with their ranches. They have been moving on and off toward more green architecture to the degree that they are doing it. They're not advertising it a whole lot, and I wish they would do it a lot more. I still think they could do better, but they recognize they build buildings all the time, and that's a major consumption of natural resources and a major contributor to greenhouse gases. So they've not only need do more of it, but they need to advertise it more. Church members need to know what they're walking into when they walk into a building. The problem there is that we've got such a centralized system that we don't have as much stewardship over our own buildings like we used to. But I think I'm expecting more, and I anticipate more. I don't know if that gives you any further encouragement. But I'll just say I've never had my wrist slapped on this at all. Not at BYU, not by any church leader, never. I've never pointed fingers and named names and made accusations. I've never tried to make this about some sort of shame game and self-righteous promotion or something. But my sense is that the church recognizes this is an area that they need to improve. Elder Ballard gave a talk at BYU just 1 week before the lockdown of COVID, and it's the reason that talk didn't get more airplay, I think. I think it's called Children of God or something like that, but you can look it up. And he says to the students, you care about the environment, and we love that you care about the environment, and we hope you continue to care about the environment. I'm badly paraphrasing what he said, but it's beautiful, and it's really clear that he thought that was a wonderful thing. So I think there are moments like that, and Bishop Cassé's talk, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit dramatic in saying this, but to me that was as historic as anything that's happened since 1978, and hardly anybody said anything. I was just like waiting for the headlines and nothing. I was like, wow, nobody even noticed. And so that's what I was trying to articulate. So maybe that was a good thing that nobody noticed, or is it a bad? I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking about, so I studied sociology at BYU a long time ago, but we talk a lot about demography, and it seems to me that, especially 70s, 80s, and early 90s, there was a socially incongruent issue with theology and science and environmentalism where there was this direct arrow pointing towards demography and population growth. And how that may have been in conflict with the theology of multiply and replenish the earth.
Yeah.
And I think that has shifted a lot because sustainability is less about population growth now and more about infrastructure and more small and simple things that we can do. And I think that the conversation and the cultural mores around that have really shifted over the last decade or so. But do you feel like that plays any sort of role in terms of people's attitude towards sustainability and environmentalism being, these dirty words that they can't get involved with because of the...
Yeah, that's a big issue. I mean, I think there's still kind of a lingering anxiety about the UN and the UN's goals about sustainability as being, draconian and being kind of Marxist or undoctrinal in some ways. So I do hear that still. That's a concern for some people, but I don't. I think you're right. I mean, I was an undergraduate at Stanford in the 1980s when Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, was there, and that was all the talk, And I remember as an undergraduate going, "Oh, I care about nature, but this doesn't seem to be inviting Christians in." So and I would get antagonized all the time about how many children I intended to have. Just a funny anecdote: I have one brother who's gay and was not intending to have children, and so my dad was like, "Well, so how many kids are they saying you can have?" And I said, "Well, they say it's like 2." And he goes, "Well, I got 2 sons, and your brother's not going to have any kids, so you go have 4." So I ended up with 4, but not because of that. I wasn't doing the math, and I wasn't feeling restricted by that. But yeah, I mean, I think that's I noticed that shift on a personal level that I didn't. But part of the problem was, again, there were other conversations in the environment happening simultaneously that were different, and much of those anxiety, I won't say population is not an issue, it's a big issue, but I mean there's some interesting things related to it, right? Like population
less
in...
so now because our replacement rate in the United States has dropped.
Right,
which
right.
Which is right along the predictions of demography from the beginning of time.
Yeah.
One of the major issues with this thesis was that it wasn't really based in demographic predictions
Yeah.
in the future.
And the education of women in a lot of developing countries, right, has driven down population growth in a healthy way for the right reasons, because they're actually part of the process of making the decision, right? And that has a big factor, and that you know, is certainly a gospel principle that we would subscribe to. So, yeah, I think that's that was more of an anxiety then, and I think there was that false equation that sustainability could only mean that one thing. I try to tell students a lot that, you know, environmental, any ism that you think of that's out there, whether it's Marxism or feminism or environmentalism, is there's many varieties of that ism, right? It's not this monolithic thing, and there might be versions of it. And this typically happens in a politically polarized environment, right? You come up with the worst version of your opponent's way of thinking, and you use that to define everything about that position, and that abdicates you of any responsibility of having to actually wrestle with the question that they're trying to get you to think about. So we are not invulnerable to that by virtue of being believers. You know, that's something we have to be super careful about, to make sure that when we feel pushed upon by a secular discourse that seems to be antagonistic, it may very well be that version of it is, but that it may not be the defining version, and it certainly won't do us any good by saying, I don't care about the environment. You know, I mean, it used to be the case, I've been in Utah for 25 years, I would get teased because I was gathering soda cans at board activities to take home and recycle. People don't do that anymore, but that was weird, you know? It's like, you know, what is it about recycling that seems to offend you, my dear brother? Yeah, what's that? One more, okay.
Very interesting. I hope you'll publish this. I'd like to get a copy if it's not published then privately, because I think it's important. I have 11 kids. I'm happy about that. I have joy in every single one of them, which goes completely against what Paul Ehrlich was preaching when I was just out of law school for a while. Part of the issue is that those of us who are committed to the environment don't necessarily agree with the policy prescriptions that are regnant on the left, if we use that, left-right dichotomy. And because we don't agree with those policy prescriptions, then we are cast out as anti-environmentalists, as Luddites, to use that phrase. And that's why I think I'm as passionate about the environment as anybody, but I don't buy into some of the policy prescriptions that are written today. And I think that's an issue that we need to address.
Yeah, that's
sort of what you just said now.
Right.
We always describe the most extreme position to our.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, I think that's what I love. What I'm seeing in Utah. I'm actually a part-time politician. I should confess. I'm a city council member in Provo, so I do wear a political hat. But and so I've had to have conversation. What I love about city politics is it's nonpartisan. So even though people try to peg people, it's really about problem solving. And when you get into the wrestle with trying to solve a problem in a practical way and not in an ideological way, you find a lot more common ground a lot more easily. I mean, I've found that even though I might be on the council with people who are very different than I am in terms of national politics or national preferences or party preferences or people in the city, when we're looking at the problem closely enough and we all drop our ideological lenses, we share the same goal of trying to solve a particular problem, then really wonderful things happen. I think that's the way it's supposed to work. I just don't think it's working really well nationally. There's a lot of research on this. Ezra Klein wrote a great book called Why We're Polarized, and I think it makes a pretty important case for why it's happening and why it's bad that it's happening, because the best solutions on policy can't come from an echo chamber. They've got to come from rigorous debate and deliberation between different-minded people. That's really where the best policy gets crafted. I'm a passionate believer in that, and I do think that that's the weakness of our party system, is that the policies are always crafted in answer to the base of whatever the party is, to say that's the kind of policy we want. But when you actually do surveys and you say, what do people really think about abortion, or what do they really think about the climate, or what do they really think about healthcare, or whatever the issue might be, or guns, you find all this room in the middle that no one's even touching. And it's weird, we're at the point now where the majority of the country, if they're asked honestly what they think about most things, they're in that middle, and the two parties are way beyond being able to communicate with them. And yet, people are perfectly happy to just let the party do all their thinking for them, right? And all their policy formation for them. So that's a pretty serious problem. And I think that's why what I like about an eco-theology as opposed to an eco-politics, I mean, it ultimately does have to get down to crafting policy, but I like that. I think it's healthier for us to start with values and principles and fundamental beliefs, so that we don't forget that whether we're conservative or liberal, we care. I mean, I love the fact, John Curtis, who's a congressman in Utah, who's my former mayor, and I know him personally, he created a conservative climate caucus. He's serious about having this conversation about the climate. He wants conservative solutions. I'm like, go for it, you know? I mean, we'll be better off if we have the debate. If both parties are owning the problem and trying to figure out solutions, then we're in a better place. I hope. All right, thanks so much.